It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, April 25th, 2025. In Los Angeles, he is Sam Park. In Reno, Nevada, I am John Ramey. And in full disclosure, we are recording this on Thursday, the 24th.
And we did not coordinate our outfits, by the way, just so you know. Right.
We're just working men.
Yeah.
That's a good note to start the affair. In this episode, we will discuss the first 100 days of the second Trump administration. We will talk about Ukraine and the latest in the maybe trade war with China. All right, Sam. You've taken me out of my comfort zone with a more conceptual episode, right? I love a template because that's what journalists on Deadline do. We just crank things out. There's like the mold, and we crank out the content. But this is a different template.
Well, we're coming up on the 100th day of the Trump administration, which is just a traditional time. I mean, John, this is certainly not foreign to your journalistic experience.
Not at all.
Okay,
certainly not.
Right, so it's a traditional time to look back at the beginning of a new presidential administration.
No, it's only out of the mold for what we have done here.
Sure, I understand.
So. All right, so I, of course, went to the great source, Wikipedia. The first 100 days of a United States president's first term, Wikipedia will probably need to update that, are sometimes used to measure a president's success and achievements when their power and influence are at its highest. I think Wikipedia is also assuming that a second term would be a consecutive term, which is not the case here. The term was coined in a July 24th, 1933 radio address by U.S. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which I had suspected. However, and this illuminates the recession of power away from the legislative branch and to the executive, Roosevelt was talking about the 100-day session of the 73rd United States Congress from March 9th to June 17th of 1933.
I didn't know that at all.
I didn't know that. Now, this is Wikipedia, rather than the first 100 days of his administration, but that is where I understood the first 100 days as a concept to have been born in media and also in presidential rhetoric.
That's interesting because generally we refer to it in terms of presidents. But as you say, because so much power has sort of leached over to the presidency from Congress, I mean, nobody talks about the first 100 days of any Congress. I mean, it's ridiculous that they don't do anything. So, I mean, it would be really boring.
I suppose they did stuff back with FDR.
Yes.
And then you sent me a wonderful column from our colleague, David Brooks, the New York Times. And I thought it was a brilliant summation of Trumpism as we now understand it with its all the restraints off here in the second term. So I'm going to read an excerpt from that Brooks piece, and then we can run with it. Does that sound good?
Sure.
Okay. David Brooks in the New York Times. Over the centuries, people built the sinews of civilization, constitutions to restrain power, international alliances to promote peace, legal systems to peacefully settle disputes, scientific institutions to cure disease, news outlets to advance public understanding, charitable organizations to ease suffering, businesses to build wealth and spread prosperity, and universities to preserve, transmit, and advance the glories of our way of life. These institutions make our lives sweet, loving, and creative, rather than nasty, brutish, and short. That, of course, is quoting Hobbes in the Leviathan, which is the foundational political text.
That is the 17th century English political thinker Thomas Hobbes.
Yeah, about power, political power. Okay,
Correct.
Back to Brooks. Trumpism is threatening all of that. It is primarily about the acquisition of power for its own sake. It is a multi-front assault to make the earth a playground for ruthless men. So, of course, any institutions that might restrain power must be weakened or destroyed. So far, we have treated the various assaults of President Trump and the acolytes in his administration as a series of different attacks. In one lane, they are going after law firms. In another, they savaged USAID. In another, they're attacking our universities. On yet another front, they're undermining NATO. And on another, they're upending global trade. These are not separate battles, says Brooks. This is a single effort to undo the parts of the civilizational order that might restrain Trump's acquisition of power. It's a great piece, but I thought that was the heart of the matter.
I think so. Yeah, and I'm generally hot and cold on David Brooks, but in this particular piece, he hit it right on the head, I think. And I sort of wanted to highlight this idea of ideology, and that's why I found interesting a quote that we'll put up here from a fellow named Tom Lee, who
Mm.
is a financial strategist, and he appears frequently on CNBC. That is a gather he does. I don't actually watch the network all that often, but he's in the studio with them generally and has a sort of familiar, colloquial manner of speaking to the on-air personalities that I gather he's on quite a lot. And this was something that he published during the early stages of the trade war during this month, where he says, quote, in the last few days, we have had many conversations with macro fund managers, and their concern is that the White House is not acting rationally, but rather on ideology. And some even fear that this may not even be ideology. A few have quietly wondered if the president might be insane. Now, here on Working for Crusoe, John, we don't generally talk very much about psychology, whereas
We're
ideology
not
is
psychologists.
no, ideology is more inside of our bailiwick. So I'd like to focus on that. I found it interesting that this came to my attention from CNBC, essentially, right? This guy's and on the business media side of
This
things,
guy's a
right?
financial analyst.
Yeah, and so the CNBC doesn't generally talk about ideology. So I thought, again, for someone like him to be bringing this up, I thought was very remarkable. And it's also, I think, useful in terms of delineating how the Trump administration, that is the second Trump administration, differs from the first. Because, John, as I'm sure you'll recall, during the first Trump administration, it was very common to hear commentators say that Trump was not ideological. And
Right. Purely transactional.
that's right. And now, mind you, that's a different topic to which we might return later today. But I always thought that that was off base. I figured at that time, mind you, during the first Trump term, that he was in fact ideological. And I think that what people meant when they said he was not was simply that he wasn't an intellectual. That is, he didn't have a manifesto, right? And in fact, isn't especially good at formulating complex ideas into coherent sentences, right?
And doesn't refer back to ideas or theories.
That's right. It's just, and he just sort of seems to be winging it, or in fact, acting by instinct. But even so, I thought, no, he does have an ideology, and it's fascism. Now, I'd like to revise that, actually, because I believe that what's occurred is that during Trump's 4-year vacation from the White House, he's been able to attract towards him a number of people who are now working for him, and some of whom were around during his first term, people like Steve Bannon, for example, who have been able to sort of spend those 4 years kind of filling in the ideological gaps in his, what we might call his product offering.
Sure.
And so
Stephen Miller, another one.
Sure. And again, Miller was there
From the
throughout.
first term.
But it's just that there are more people like them that are surrounding Trump now that are really all on the same page. Whereas, as we recall, during the first term, there were many sort of traditional
Adults
Republicans,
in the room?
yes, right, who because he'd never run for anything, he probably didn't expect to win, so that he had to sort of draw from the kind of general staffing pool
Sure.
of the Republican Party as it then existed. Whereas now it's really the Trump regime. And so I think it helps to sort of review a lot of the things that have happened since he won re-election. For example, as we've mentioned on this show before, it's only since he won in November that he began talking about annexing Canada and retaking the Panama Canal, retaking Greenland. And in our last episode prior to his inauguration, I speculated at the time that it seemed as though the era of American greatness to which he wished to return the nation was something like the 19th century. Now,
Late
at
19th century.
yes, at that moment, I presented that as just a possible outlier scenario of what he might be after. But since he's taken office, it's been very easy to find many commentators saying this exact same thing, that it's some weird 19th century recidivism that he's aiming at. Now,
Infatuation with William McKinley.
exactly. I
Right.
mean, this goes on and on and on, right? Now, I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, right? Because I'm sure that a lot of the people that I've heard say this since then were thinking along the same lines even before he was inaugurated. It's just that it's become a much more commonly heard idea since he's taken office than it was at the time when I first brought it up.
Okay. Now, I also want to point out that, Sam, you using the term fascism to describe what you thought Trump's initial term's ideology was, is backed up by none other than one of his former chiefs of staff. I believe it was John Kelly, who said he's a fascist.
Yes.
So we are not just hyperbolic liberals here, right?
That's right. But Kelly said that before, I think it was even before the election.
Before the 24 election, 100%.
Yeah, I think
he
that's
said
right.
it during the 24 campaign.
That's right. And so at this point, I'd like to amend my idea that it's fascist.
Is that just chronological? Because fascism wasn't
That's right.
fully cooked in the late 19th century?
Exactly. At this point, for instance, the 19th century imperialism is actually the parent of fascism. But at this point, it sort of seems like a sort of superstore of authoritarianism, or to borrow another idea,
Like Costco?
just like sort of a multi-CD box set of a musical
Sure.
artist,
An
right?
anthology.
Career spanning, right? So it's just sort
Right.
of some of it's fascist, some of it's McCarthyist. For example,
Totally.
the law under which Secretary of State Marco Rubio is actually allowed to just deport any foreign student here on on a visa.
Yeah.
He can just yank that visa and say you've got to leave.
That's a McCarthy era law that's still on the books.
McCarthy era law. And some of it, as we've mentioned, is from the 19th century. So there's even this sort of weirdly male dominant sexual predation element that I think would be very familiar to citizens of the Roman Empire. I think they would understand that very easily, where it's generally not been part of our political culture in modern times. So again,
There is the overt masculinity of fascism, but you're talking about a predation that is more sinister.
overt. It's much more overt,
Yeah.
right? And I think this is what Brooks is getting at when he says it's actually all the same thing, right? And so on our show, we generally talk about foreign policy and economics. And, sometimes those are separate stories, but sometimes they intersect, as with the trade war. But again, Brooks is exactly right. All of these things are actually the same thing. So as we look back at the late 19th century, let's think about what America looked like at that time. Okay, there was no
multicultural democracy.
That's right. There was no Department of Education. There was no federal government, really, as we understand it. Right? There was no income tax. There was no penicillin.
No central bank.
That's right. Exactly. No central bank. Most people didn't have indoor plumbing, and so the idea that this is the era to which we should want to return, it's disturbing, frankly.
Deeply disturbing. Women couldn't vote.
That's right. Minorities maybe technically could vote, but on a practical level,
You
they
had
couldn't.
apartheid in
That's right.
many states.
Yeah, we were the United States was about to embark on very specifically race-based immigration policies, and very restrictive immigration policies, that is. And so if you look at it through this lens, every single thing he does makes sense. Now, I want to sort of wind this up by saying that this isn't going especially well. At the very beginning of his term, back in January, it seemed like he was leading this sort of right-wing wave across the globe that was sweeping all before it. But and especially since Liberation Day, things are not working out for him politically.
Is it revanchist anti-global wave has petered out?
Yeah, I believe, well, maybe not petered out, but it's certainly not as strong as it seemed when he
Right.
took office.
In an
Uh,
international sense.
exactly. And this is something that we'll discuss in our next segments today, but also in future episodes coming up, depending on how things shake out.
Um, yeah, again, this is not a political theory podcast generally, but this does touch on something that you and I have talked about regarding not only Donald Trump but Vladimir Putin, in that they both seem to not only have not learned the brutal lessons of the 20th century, they actively disdain them.
That's
And
right.
so it makes all the sense in the world. He wants to go back to a world where the Chinese and later Asian Exclusion Act are good immigration policy in his mind.
Yes, and just to sort of set the scene on a slightly more specific level, uh, Trump seems to believe that there are three world powers, three great powers in the world today, and it's the United States, China, and Russia. Now, I'd like to say that I think he's really overestimating the power of
Of
Russia
Russia,
in
sure.
this case, but in his mind,
They have
those are
nukes.
those are the three great powers. And it seems to be that you should have nuclear weapons, very large landmass, and a population of at least 100 million people. Now, he might think of India perhaps as a rising and potential world power because they fit into all those categories. The problem is that India doesn't menace its neighbors, right? Or they might be starting to do that, but we'll get back to that in a couple of weeks. But for instance, Ukraine, that is Russia, we know, has invaded Ukraine. China is ramping up its aggressive posture towards Taiwan very dramatically. And it almost seems like Trump felt like that if he wasn't menacing his own immediate neighbors,
He
he was,
wasn't in the club.
yeah, he was falling down the division standings, right? And
Yeah.
so this is why he had to bring this out. That's, of course, an oversimplification, but I don't think it's an
No,
implausible
yeah.
one.
I've got to menace Canada, otherwise these other strong men are going to look tougher than me.
Yes, but in general, he thinks that the great world powers should just generally get along with one another. And in fact, as we've mentioned, he thinks that alliances are just for suckers. So it's not that he actually wants to be the ally of China or Russia. If somebody were to attack China or Russia, I don't think he'd want to do anything at all about it, as an ally would do. He just thinks that they should generally stay out of each other's way and out of each other's neighborhood. And this is why he wants to wind up the Ukraine war. He's just like, I don't want anything to do with this. It's not our neighborhood. It should be all up to them. But that's obviously not going very well for him. But on top of that, he also seems to want to think, and I think that this is where this falls apart. It's one thing to want to just generally get along with the other great powers of the world, but he also seems to want, just on a personal level, to be friends with
Sure.
Putin and Xi
To
Jinping.
have them respect him.
In fact, yeah, in fact,
They are the new Manhattan. He's the idiot from Queens.
he's routinely referred to very recently, Xi Jinping, even during the trade war, as he said, I consider him a good friend, and I don't think that Xi considers Trump to be his friend, and so he's setting himself up as a sucker here. I think
Yeah. I mean, it is pathetic in a sense.
it is. I mean, and I don't think that people have quite wanted to come out and say this because it makes the United States look terrible.
Right. Do you have more to say about the 100 days and the ideology, or do you want to dive into Ukraine and China,
No, I
both
think
of which are
that
kind of very related to this?
the thing is, I could talk about the ideology for an
Yeah.
hour, but I
Well,
think
because it's hard to find, it's kind of hard to unearth his ideology when, just in a rhetorical sense, he's just kind of vomiting spaghetti at the wall to see what sticks. I mean,
yes,
every time he opens his mouth, it's a trial balloon to kind of see, well, what do they like, right?
yes.
Is it Arendt who talks about propaganda going both ways?
Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
But I think that we could talk about the ideology for quite some time. But the thing is, I'm sure we'll refer to it, and I think we might as well move on to the more specific stories
sure.
because it does have bearing. The
It does.
ideological framework has bearing on both of the segments that we're going to do coming up just now.
Yeah, there is something kind of, I don't know if the right word is comforting, but it's nice to have something like an operating theory about what he's doing, because otherwise it's just seems uh, Seems like he's insane, to quote our
That's right.
financial analyst.
I think that our public understanding has been enhanced, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not going to hear people say anymore that he's not ideological, right? I don't think that that's something that people are going to keep talking about.
Okay, let's move to Ukraine, which again, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, starting in February of 2022, is the biggest land war in Europe since the end of the Second World War. This is still going on. Hundreds of thousands of people have died. Dateline Kyiv, CNN reports. U.S. President Donald Trump said he is, quote, not happy after Russia launched its deadliest wave of attacks on Kyiv in 9 months, telling President Vladimir Putin to, quote, all caps, stop, exclamation point, as he attempts to push Ukraine to agree on a contentious ceasefire proposal. This is Trump's Truth Social saying stop. Moscow sent 70 missiles and 145 drones towards Ukraine, mainly targeting Kyiv, in an attack that Ukrainian leader Volodymyr Zelensky said was aimed at pressuring the United States. Quote, saying here, quote, Trump saying here, quote, I am not happy with the Russian strikes on Kyiv. Not necessary. Very bad timing. Vladimir, stop. 5,000 soldiers a week are dying. Let's get the peace deal done, Trump wrote on Truth Social on Thursday. That's today. At least 12 people died in the strikes, with 90 injured, according to Ukraine's emergency services. More casualties may be trapped under the rubble. The emergency services says Moscow's assault struck 13 locations in Kyiv, including residential buildings and civilian infrastructure. It was the costliest attack on the city since July of 2024.
Yes, it's just ghastly. But I think just in general terms, I don't know exactly what's going on, but it's a reasonable inference to draw that Putin is just taunting him. Because yesterday, it seemed as though the United States was on the verge of walking away from Ukraine. And in fact, people like Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and J.D. Vance, the Vice President, were saying, if we can't get this done, we're just going to walk away. And it sort of feels like Putin saying, no, you're not walking away. I'm chasing you away.
I'm kicking
you
out.
That's right. And so just, let's get this straight. And I think that what he generally might have done is try to keep the United States involved, right? Because
he knows it weakens the United States, right? It keeps us distracted with something. It's politically divisive, even within Trump's own party.
Yes, and it damages Trump. Right? Because Trump has said over and over again that he wants to make a deal. I'll do it in 24 hours. Or he actually did at one point set the 100-day mark as maybe a more reasonable time frame. And so Putin's going, no, I'm going to keep you here. And you know what? Maybe you will walk away. All right. But it's going to look like I chased you out.
Yeah, it's not going to be peace with honor, to borrow a phrase.
That's right. And exactly. Right. And so, again, Putin's not acting like he cares if Trump is his friend. And so if Trump is confused or unhappy about this, for instance, he said a couple weeks ago that he was, or the reporting anyway, was that he was, quote, pissed off, unquote, at Putin, right? And he was beginning to get the idea that Putin might be stringing him along. And I'm like, oh, good. I'm glad you picked up on that, because I don't think he was the first person to think that. I think a lot of people have
this has been suggested.
Yes, right. And so it's like, the problem with that, though, is that if you and I think that Putin is stringing him along, and he's beginning to think that Putin is stringing him along, we're not the only ones, right? People all over the world not only believe that Putin is stringing him along, right, but that Putin has demonstrated that Trump can be strung along, right? And that this is how you can get what you want out of Trump. Just drag it out, right? Just drag it out over and over again, and he'll eventually cave, or in some cases, quickly cave. And so this is a real weakness of Trump's, that he doesn't seem to understand, that he's revealing to the world all the time, and that it's not particularly difficult to get him to reveal that weakness. And again, it's extremely unnerving. Uh, as in the case of so many of the other things we've talked about, for instance, the Signalgate controversy of a few weeks ago, which is now reared up again with a second signal conversation indulged in by our Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, who's, again, one of these people who's come to Trump during his interregnum, right? He fits right in with this, I'm a warrior, ideologue idea of the people in the second Trump term. But this supposedly mighty warrior
He's
seems
a
to
moron and a gossip.
yeah, and it seems to take a sort of juvenile delight in talking to people about how he's blowing things up.
Like an eighth grader.
Yes, it's so disquieting that this is someone who's in charge of the world's largest military, and so I don't know why I'm not having more trouble sleeping.
Right. Because again, political polarization or how you feel about the left-right divide in this country, these are the people tasked with keeping us safe.
Yes, this puts all of us in danger.
Keeping the world orderly. There are people who don't like this country that have nuclear weapons, that have intercontinental ballistic missiles. We need competent people manning the ramparts here. Pete Hegseth is not competent.
That's right.
It's a shame, and this is not something that often crosses my mind or my lips, but it is a shame Donald Rumsfeld is not here to tell us what he thinks of Pete Hegseth's performance.
I don't think it's a shame, right? I mean,
no, he would have said something interesting, and you know it.
Well,
or at least memorable.
It would have been quotable.
Pithy.
Let's put it that way. Yeah, it would be good copy for us, but I don't think it would have actually helped anything. I think we've got actually a pretty good grasp of how this works out, but it would have been pithily phrased.
You're right. I guess the Chinese are already telling us that these people are morons. Okay. To China?
Yes, please.
Okay. Trade war that isn't. Now, you sent me a great article from the Global Times, but I'm going to start with something from Reuters from today. China called for all, quote, unilateral U.S. tariffs to be canceled on Thursday today as signs emerged that the Trump administration may de-escalate its trade war with Beijing. China also clarified it has not held trade talks with Washington despite repeated comments from the U.S. government suggesting there had been engagement. So these people are not only incompetent, but they're liars. Remember that.
Yes. Although I should say that the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, yesterday said, no, we haven't talked to them. Right. He was very upfront about this, unlike his boss.
Good for Scott. Donald Trump has repeatedly said that the U.S. will have a deal with China. And on Wednesday, 2 days from when this is published, said there was, quote, direct contact between both countries. Trump, who calls his tariffs reciprocal, says the duties aim to correct unfair trade imbalances with the U.S. The U.S. should remove, quote, all, quote, unilateral tariff measures against China if it truly wanted to solve the trade issue, Commerce Ministry spokesperson He Yadong said on Thursday. So basically, Trump is trying to now put out the brush fire he started intentionally.
That's right. In fact, he insists today, that is Thursday, that they are in fact talking to the Chinese. Now, who can say? I mean, it's not like I want to trust the Chinese Commerce Ministry either, but I think he's lying, right? I don't think they've talked to anybody. I don't think anybody will pick up the phone because, again, China's got his number, right? Over and over again. Since launching the trade war, he's retreated across numerous fronts. And then again, earlier this week, he was bullying the Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell. The investment markets flipped out. And then so he had to backtrack on that again. It's, I never intended to fire him, which is, again, a lie, right? He said in a very sort of wimpy, passive-aggressive manner that Powell's termination couldn't come soon enough, right? As if it was, a barometric front or something, right? It was just something that was going to happen. It's
or like, summer.
No, you're the one who would fire him, right? But again, he seemed to even want to disclaim his own responsibility for doing that. And so the markets flipped out, and so he had to retreat. And so China knows that they don't have to do anything. And so they're saying, look, just drop all the tariffs. If you want to start negotiating, just, retreat more and maybe we can talk. But up until that point, they're not interested in doing anything.
The Global Times reporting that China's Ministry of Education, which they abbreviate MOE, which I like because it reminds me of the Three Stooges, the MO, on Tuesday announced an updated undergraduate program catalog adding 29 new majors in emerging sectors such as artificial intelligence and the low altitude economy, which will be included in this year's Gaokao, or National College Entrance Examinations, according to an official statement. These new majors accord with national strategies, market demands, and technological development needs to support national strategies. Specialties such as regional and country studies, carbon neutrality, science and engineering, marine science and technology, and health and medical security are being established, according to the statement. Trump, I think, in response to this, also issued an executive order this week, perhaps today, kind of frontlining AI education within United States curricula as much as he can with an executive order. But again, it seems like he's reacting to something China's doing.
Well, not just that, but he's doing it apparently under the auspices of the Department of Education, which he's trying to dismantle. So
Right.
I don't know exactly how effective he thinks that's going to be. But this gets to a point that, for instance, I think the tariffs are going to be just terribly damaging to our country going forward. But they could be withdrawn at any time, right? And even if he doesn't do it, the next president can easily do it. My bigger concern for the American economy is actually the enormous cuts in funding for scientific research, which has been the linchpin of American prosperity since the end of the Second World War. We have over and over again been the world leader in scientific research, and this has given us medicines, the internet, the
smartphones,
program.
Yeah.
I mean, and the entirety of modern life essentially is
satellite communication.
Yes, is reliant upon the enormous amounts of money that we spend on scientific research in this country. But again, this is an ideological position, right? There was no scientific research done in this country in the 19th century, and so there shouldn't be now anymore. And so much of this ideological positioning seems to be.
You mean in terms of a federal government program on the scale of what we have now?
Yeah, or even privately. I mean, someone like Thomas Edison, they weren't growing on trees, and people didn't have the means to do that sort of research. It was amazing that Edison and Bell and people like this even existed at all.
You may have had like the Navy being sent places for cartographical reasons or something, but that's about it.
That's about all. And so if we're going to get rid of that, that could very seriously undermine our prosperity going forward in this country, much more, I think, than the tariffs. But again, this is sort of weird macho idea of what it means to be an American. We don't want to be intellectuals who do scientific research. The anti-intellectualism of this administration is just off the chart. We want to be big, strong men who dig rocks up out of the ground and bash them into metal and make cars out of them. And those cars have to, by the way, burn rocks
oil.
That we also dig out of the ground. And I don't think anybody actually wants to live that way. But I think that cultural sort of posturing is appealing to a lot of people in many ways, as frightening as it is to me.
Okay. Next week.
Well, we've got a lot going on next week. On Monday, Canada goes to the polls, and this will be very much in keeping with the theme that we've been talking about today, because Donald Trump has made himself essentially the number one issue in the Canadian election. We might also want to talk about the terrorist attack in India. Depending on if
Kashmir.
We should at least mention it, but it could actually blow up into some kind of kerfluffle between India and Pakistan. We might hope it does not. And then on top of that, well, we'll just have to see what else happens.
Okay. Thanks for being with us. He's Sam. I'm John. Have yourselves a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.